The smell hit first, kerosene and pine tar, sharp enough to strip paint from wood. Then came the screaming from behind locked doors. This is the story of how one young man turned a frontier courthouse into an inferno, and why the ashes contained a secret that would divide a town for generations. Dustridge, Montana Territory, 1852. The settlement clung to the valley like a scar on virgin timber, all rough-hewn logs and canvas awnings where prospectors and drifters built America's newest gold rush town. The courthouse sat on the eastern bluff, weathered pine logs chinked with clay and river mud, housing 7 judges who dispensed justice with gavel and noose. At night, oil lamps cast shadows that danced like specters across walls that had witnessed too many hangings to count. And one boy, barely 16, was about to make them witness something far worse. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dustridge, Montana Territory, 1852. The settlement sprawled across the valley floor like a drunk's vomit, all mismatched timber and mud-caked canvas, where fortune-seekers built their temporary kingdoms on stolen land and broken promises. Gold had been discovered in the nearby hills 18 months earlier, and like flies to carrion, thousands had descended upon territory that the Salish people had called home for generations beyond counting. The courthouse sat on the eastern bluff, a 2-story structure of hewn pine logs that the town fathers had erected with more ambition than skill. Its foundation rested on sandstone blocks quarried from the riverbed, mortared together with a mixture of clay, ash, and the crushed bones of animals that once grazed these meadows. 7 judges administered territorial law from this building, men who'd arrived from back east carrying leather-bound law books, and an unshakable conviction that civilization could be imposed through paperwork and the hangman's rope. At night, whale oil lamps burned in the upper chambers where the judges kept their private quarters during court sessions. The light flickered through wavy glass windows, casting distorted shadows across walls lined with territorial maps and legal precedents that meant nothing to the people who'd lived here first. Tobias Crow moved through Dustridge like a ghost, present but rarely acknowledged. The townspeople called him the witch's son, though they only whispered it when they thought he couldn't hear. His mother had been Calis Norwick, a woman of mixed blood, Salish mother and a French trapper father, who'd practiced the old healing arts with roots and herbs and ceremonies that made the Christian settlers deeply uncomfortable. She'd lived on the settlement's margins, in a dugout shelter, carved into the hillside where the respectable folk rarely ventured. Tobias was 16 years old, though frontier life had carved years into his face that he hadn't yet lived. His features told the story of 2 worlds colliding, his mother's high cheekbones and dark eyes set in skin that could pass for white in certain light, with certain lies. He'd learned early that survival meant code switching, speaking English without accent when addressing the miners, reverting to his mother's language when gathering herbs in the hills where her people still hunted. His sister had disappeared 11 weeks earlier, Nadira Queleth, 2 years younger, with their mother's gift for plant medicine and a laugh that could make even the hardest prospector smile. She'd been taken in broad daylight while collecting willow bark along Kettlebone Creek. The judges claimed she'd gone willingly to work in the courthouse kitchens, that they were offering her honest employment and Christian education. The bruises Tobias glimpsed through the courthouse windows when he brought firewood told a different story. Before we descend deeper into this frontier nightmare, I want to know where you're watching from right now. What part of the world are you in? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this grip you by the throat and won't let go, hit that like button and subscribe. Because what you're about to hear has been buried in territorial archives for over a century and a half, hidden beneath layers of official history that preferred convenient lies to uncomfortable truths. The plan began forming the night Tobias heard Nadira singing through the courthouse's back window. Not the happy songs from before, but something older and more terrible, a keening sound their mother had taught them for when the world breaks beyond any hope of repair. He understood then that some chains don't break with pleading or negotiation or faith in a justice system that had never been designed to protect people like them. Some chains only break with fire. He spent 3 weeks gathering what he needed. Hemlock grew wild in the shadowed places where Kettlebone Creek pooled into stagnant eddies. The settlers knew enough to avoid it. recognized the distinctive spotted stems and the rank smell of mouse urine that marked its presence. But they didn't know the old preparation methods, how to extract and concentrate the alkaloids until a few drops could paralyze the respiratory system, how to mask the bitter taste with wild honey and the fermented juice of chokecherries. The courthouse kitchens had started accepting food deliveries from the native camp, a gesture of goodwill that the judges thought demonstrated their enlightened approach to territorial administration. They believed they were civilizing the savages through employment and exposure to Christian domesticity. Tobias encouraged this belief, bringing smoked venison wrapped in birch bark, wild onions roasted in the traditional way, always keeping his eyes down, always saying "yes, sir," and "thank you, sir," in tones of practiced deference. Trust, he learned, was just another weapon, as sharp as any blade when wielded with patience and precision. On the night of August 17, 1852, he brought them whiskey. The judges appreciated spirits more than food, especially whiskey flavored with wild honey and something else they couldn't quite identify, a slight earthiness that disappeared after the second swallow, masked by the burn of alcohol and the sweetness of stolen honey from trees his mother had taught him to read like books. The hemlock worked slowly, carefully measured to cause drowsiness first, disorientation second, paralysis third. By midnight, 7 men lay in their bunks in various states of stupor, their gavels and law books stacked uselessly on desks they could no longer reach, their authority dissolved in poison and failing coordination. Tobias walked through the courthouse like something that had already died and didn't know enough to stop moving. He moved through rooms where maps divided territory into parcels for sale, where legal documents transferred ownership of land that had never belonged to anyone, because the very concept of ownership was foreign to the people who'd stewarded it for countless generations. Most judges were unconscious now, sprawled across their beds or collapsed beside their chamber pots. A few watched him with drugged confusion, their eyes tracking his movement, but their mouths unable to form words, their hands unable to reach for the pistols they kept loaded beside their beds. He found Nadira in the back room where the judges kept their domestic servants, a windowless space that had probably been intended for storage before being repurposed for housing the people they employed. She was already dead. Her body showed why, showed what had been done to her repeatedly over the 11 weeks since her disappearance. Beside her lay another girl, maybe 12 years old, a Salish speaker Tobias didn't recognize, but whose injuries told the same story his sister's corpse was telling. This second girl, Erisa Dornell, still breathed, but barely. Her eyes tracked Tobias with animal recognition, but no human understanding remained behind them. Something had broken inside her that no medicine could repair, no ceremony could restore. What would you do, standing in that room? Would you try to save the one who still drew breath, knowing that moving her might mean exposure, might mean capture before you finished what you'd started? Or would you complete your mission, understanding that some mercies arrive disguised as abandonment, that sometimes the kindest thing is to let the dying die in peace, rather than drag them into a future where survival means nothing but prolonged suffering? The kerosene was stored in barrels in the ground floor storage room, meant for the lamps that kept justice burning through the night. Tobias had studied the courthouse's layout during his deliveries over the past 3 weeks, memorizing which floorboards creaked, which doors swung on rusted hinges that squealed, which windows had been nailed shut after last winter, when Judge Christopher Thomas complained about drafts disturbing his sleep. He worked methodically, moving through the building with the silence his mother had taught him, the skill of walking through forest without disturbing a single leaf or snapping a single twig. In frontier settlements, noise meant attention, and attention meant questions, and questions from the wrong people meant the noose or a bullet, or simply disappearing into the hills with a bounty on your head. The kerosene splashed across wooden floors that had been planed smooth by convict labor. Men who'd been sentenced to territorial service for crimes as minor as stealing bread or as serious as murder, all of them working under the supervision of these same judges who now lay paralyzed in their beds. He poured it across the stairs that led to the upper chambers, across the threshold of every door, creating barriers of liquid fuel that would transform into walls of flame the moment fire touched them. He left Erisa where she lay beside Nadira's corpse. Moving her would have meant carrying her through the building, leaving traces, creating evidence, risking discovery before the work was complete. Some mercies come disguised as cruelty. And sometimes survival means abandoning those you wish you could save, because saving one means losing everything, means failing the larger purpose that their deaths might serve. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He returned to Judge Thomas's chamber one final time. This man had been the worst of them, the one whose appetites were legendary even in a town where appetites ran wild and unchecked. Thomas had come from Philadelphia, bringing with him law degrees from prestigious universities and a wife who died of cholera during the journey west, or so he claimed. Tobias had heard other stories from women who worked in the settlement's brothels, stories about bruises and broken bones, and requests that even the most desperate wouldn't fulfill for any price. Thomas lay on his bed, eyes open but unfocused, breathing shallow but steady. The hemlock had him now, his nervous system shutting down in sequence. First the voluntary muscles, then coordination, soon the diaphragm that kept his lungs working. He'd be dead within an hour, even without the fire, suffocating slowly while his brain remained conscious enough to understand what was happening. Tobias leaned close, speaking in English so there'd be no confusion, no language barrier to hide behind. My sister's name was Nadira Quillith. You took her from Kettlebone Creek on June 3rd. You called it employment. She called it slavery. I call it something else, something that doesn't have polite words in your language or mine. Thomas's eyes moved, tracking Tobias's face. Recognition flickered there, understanding perhaps, or just the animal awareness of prey finally comprehending that the predator has arrived. His mouth worked, trying to form words, but the hemlock had stolen his voice along with his coordination. I want you to know, Tobias continued, his voice steady despite the rage that burned behind his ribs like coals, that what's about to happen isn't justice. Justice would require a system that recognized people like us as human. This is just balance. You took something from me, from my mother's people, from every person whose land you've stolen and whose lives you've destroyed with your laws and your papers and your certainty that God blessed your civilization while cursing ours. I'm taking something back. Not the same thing, because nothing can return what you've stolen, but something. A reckoning measured in ash and smoke. He straightened, looking around the chamber one last time. Law books lined the shelves, their leather spines embossed with gold lettering that proclaimed the absolute authority of territorial statutes and federal precedents. Maps covered the walls, showing proposed railroad routes and mining claims, and the steady march of what they called progress across land that had sustained nations for longer than their nation had existed. The other judges received no such speeches. They'd be dead soon. Some from the poison, some from the fire, all of them beyond caring about words or explanations, or the reasons why a 16-year-old boy with mixed blood and a murdered sister had decided that their lives were the price for the injustices they'd administered. He struck the flint at 17 minutes past midnight, and the courthouse became a furnace. The flames caught faster than he'd anticipated, racing across kerosene-soaked wood with hungry purpose, following the trails he'd laid like a map written in liquid fire. The sound was immense, a roaring that drowned out thought, that filled the building with heat and light, and the acrid smoke of burning pine. Men woke screaming, stumbling from their beds into corridors, already impassable with flame. Their coordination, already destroyed by hemlock, made them helpless against the inferno. They crashed into walls, into each other, into furniture that had become obstacles and smoke so thick you couldn't see your own hands. A few made it to windows, only to find them nailed shut, the courthouse's own security measures becoming their tomb, trapping them inside while the fire consumed everything that could burn. Tobias stood in the shadows of the cottonwood trees that grew along the bluff's edge, watching the flames paint the night sky orange and red, and a yellow so bright it hurt to look at directly. He listened to the sounds that would follow him into every dream for whatever remained of his life, the screaming that started human and became something else, something animal and primal and utterly stripped of the civilization these men had claimed, made them superior to the people they'd displaced. But fire reveals what darkness hides, and as the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning timber, Tobias saw something that stopped his heart mid-beat. A figure in the doorway, too small to be a judge, too pale to be full-blood native. The flames hadn't yet reached this section, and in the firelight, he recognized features that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist. His own eyes staring back at him from a face he'd never seen before, his own nose and mouth wrapped in skin lighter than his, darker than the judge's, a face that existed in the space between worlds where he'd spent his entire life, never quite belonging to either. His mother had kept secrets. She'd had to. Survival meant hiding pregnancies that resulted from violence rather than choice, meant sending infants away to be raised by relatives who lived beyond the settlement's reach, meant protecting offspring from fathers who'd raped their mothers, and might do worse to any evidence of those crimes. The boy in the doorway, maybe 6 years old, maybe 7, bore features Tobias recognized because he saw them every time he looked in still water. This was his brother, his half-brother, the product of the same violence that had probably created Tobias himself, though his mother had never spoken of it directly, had only warned him that some of the judges looked at him with particular intensity, as if recognizing something they'd planted and then forgotten. He'd killed his own brother, along with the man who'd probably fathered them both. The fire burned until dawn, and by the time Dustridge's bucket brigade arrived, nothing remained but smoking timber and the smell of cooked meat that would linger in the valley for weeks, that would work its way into clothing and hair, and the collective memory of everyone who'd witnessed the courthouse transform from symbol of authority into crematorium. 7 judges dead, the official count would say, plus 2 native girls who'd been sleeping in the back rooms. They never mentioned the boy. Mixed-blood offspring were inconvenient truths, better left unrecorded, easier to forget than to explain to wives back east, or congregations who believed their representatives of civilization were above such base appetites. But what the official count didn't know was that one person still stood in the cottonwood shadows, covered in ash and the terrible comprehension that vengeance and justice are not synonyms, that some fires consume everything, including the parts of yourself you'd forgotten existed, the family you'd never known you had, the futures that violence destroys without discrimination or mercy. The real horror wasn't the burning. It was what came after, the recognition that every action carries consequences that ripple outward in ways impossible to predict or control, that righteousness can coexist with monstrosity, that the same person can be victim and perpetrator depending on which moment you examine, which perspective you adopt, which truth you choose to privilege over competing truths that are equally valid and equally damning. Smoke still rose from the ruins when Territorial Governor Alexander Davis convened his emergency council at 8 that morning. The territory's entire judicial system had just burned alive, and someone would answer for it. Dustridge's 300 souls gathered in clusters around the smoldering courthouse. Prospectors whispered behind their hands. Merchants shouted contradictory theories. And the native people who lived on the settlement's margins watched with faces carved from stone, revealing nothing, acknowledging nothing, simply bearing witness the way they'd borne witness to 3 years of displacement and degradation. The August heat made the ash smell worse, mixing with pine sap and the underlying stench of burned flesh to create an odor that coated the back of your throat like guilt, like complicity, like the recognition that everyone in Dustridge had known what was happening in that courthouse, and nobody had done anything to stop it. Sheriff William Brown walked the perimeter with a measuring chain, trying to reconstruct what mathematics and malice had conspired to create this catastrophe. The fire had started in multiple locations simultaneously. The doors had been soaked with accelerant. The windows showed signs of having been sealed from outside. This wasn't accident or natural disaster. This was premeditated murder, executed with patience and precision by someone who'd studied the building's vulnerabilities and exploited them with surgical efficiency. Tobias sat with other native people near Kettlebone Creek, skinning a rabbit with a flint blade as if the world hadn't ended overnight, as if he hadn't just murdered 8 people, including his own brother whose existence he'd discovered at the moment of killing him. His hands moved steadily through familiar motions. Cut, strip, separate. The rhythm older than territorial law, older than the concept of murder as crime, rather than necessity. The other native people gave him space without being obvious about it. They knew, not the details perhaps, but the shape of what had happened, the why of it. Knowledge moved through their community like water through sand, invisible but thorough, shared through glances and silences, and the small gestures that carried meaning for those who'd learned to communicate under the surveillance of people who wanted to control not just their land, but their very thoughts and words. From the Territorial Marshal's log, August 18, 1852, inspection of courthouse ruins reveals no evidence of external attack. Fire appears to have originated in multiple locations. Survivors, none. Cause under investigation. Evidence suggests deliberate arson. Native population under suspicion, but no witnesses have come forward. Sheriff Brown stood at the ruin's edge and understood immediately what the log would never record. You didn't get simultaneous ignition points from accident, or even from a single arsonist working in panic. This had been planned with the patience of someone who'd learned to wait, who'd watched and studied and chosen the exact moment when 7 men would be too compromised to save themselves, too paralyzed by poison to reach the weapons they kept loaded beside their beds. He looked toward the native camp and saw Tobias's steady work, saw the way the other natives had positioned themselves, not close enough to seem protective, not far enough to suggest abandonment, creating a human barrier that didn't look like a barrier but functioned as one nonetheless. He said nothing. What makes a man stay silent when he knows the truth? Was it guilt? Recognition that the judges had earned this ending through their own actions? Was it pragmatism, understanding that accusing without proof would start a conflict the settlement couldn't win, that the native population could fade into the hills and wage guerrilla war that would make mining operations impossible? Or was it something simpler, the exhaustion of maintaining civilization's pretense in a place where civilization had arrived, carrying Bibles in one hand and bills of sale in the other, preaching salvation while practicing theft on a continental scale? The investigation lasted 5 days and discovered exactly what it was permitted to discover. The fire had started from knocked-over lamps, multiple lamps, because judges were careless with flame, and frontier buildings were tinderboxes waiting for ignition. The doors had been soaked with kerosene because someone, probably one of the judges themselves, had been cleaning or refilling lamps. The 2 native girls found dead in the back rooms had been trapped like everyone else, innocent victims of tragic accident. Case closed. Bodies buried in the settlement's growing cemetery. New courthouse already being planned on higher ground, with stone construction instead of timber, with external locks on windows, with security measures designed to prevent exactly this kind of catastrophe from happening again. But some truths refuse burial. 3 prospectors had been drinking behind the assay office that night, too drunk to sleep, sober enough to see. Their testimony, given quietly to Sheriff Brown and never written down, told a different story. They'd seen a figure, male, young, native or mixed blood, it was hard to tell in moonlight, moving around the courthouse's perimeter just before midnight. He'd been carrying something, maybe barrels, maybe bundles. The darkness and distance made details uncertain. When the flames erupted, he hadn't run toward the fire to help, or away from it in fear. He'd stood motionless in the cottonwood shadows, watching until a section of roof collapsed inward, and he'd made a sound the prospectors couldn't quite describe. Not celebration, not grief. Something older than English had words for. Something that came from a place where justice and vengeance and grief and rage all mixed together into an emotion that civilization tried to separate into discrete categories, but that actually existed as a single terrible whole. "Did you report this?" Brown asked. "What would we report, Sheriff? That a native boy stood on open ground? That he made a noise when 7 men burned? Half the settlement was standing there by the end, watching the flames. You going to arrest everyone who witnessed it?" Brown dismissed them without another word, understanding that some investigations dead end, not because the truth can't be found, but because finding it would require consequences nobody wanted to face. The boy's body was discovered on August 20th by miners clearing debris for the salvage timber that hadn't burned completely. He was maybe 6 or 7 years old. Impossible to tell exactly after the fire's work. What identified him as mixed blood was the hair, not quite straight, not quite the texture of full-blood natives, and the facial structure that suggested 2 worlds meeting in one small skull that would never grow into adulthood. No one knew his name. No one admitted to knowing he'd existed. Judge Christopher Thomas, who might have recognized his own features in the dead boy's face, was ashen bone fragments beyond questioning. They buried the boy in the unmarked section where the settlement disposed of inconveniences, stillborn infants from the brothels, executed claim jumpers, problems without solutions that were easier to forget than to acknowledge. Tobias watched from a distance across Kettlebone Creek, working a whetstone against his hunting knife with slow, deliberate strokes that created a rhythm to count the seconds, the minutes, the hours between this moment and whatever came next. Grief disguised as routine maintenance, sorrow hidden behind practical tasks that frontier survival demanded regardless of how your heart was breaking. That night, he walked to the burial ground alone. The settlement's pigs and dogs had already started rooting in the fresh earth, scavengers that understood better than humans that death created opportunities for feeding. Nothing stayed buried long in Dustridge's hungry soil, not bodies, not secrets, not the truth about what civilization actually meant when it arrived carrying law books and land deeds. He didn't cry. The Salish people had songs for mourning, rituals for sending spirits home to the star roads where ancestors waited. But Tobias had broken something when he lit that fire, had crossed boundaries that the old ceremonies hadn't been designed to address. The traditional ways didn't account for people who killed their own blood, even accidentally, even as unintended consequence and righteous vengeance against those who destroyed everything worth protecting. He stood in the darkness and felt himself suspended between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, welcomed completely by none. His mother's people saw him as too white, too contaminated by his father's blood, whoever that father had been. The settlers saw him as too native, too savage, too connected to the land they wanted to claim as empty wilderness waiting for their transformative touch. And now he'd added a third exile, the moral isolation of someone who'd committed an act so complex in its motivations and consequences that no single framework, native or European, could fully judge it. From Tobias's perspective, though we only have fragments passed down through oral histories that were later recorded, the boy had been hidden somewhere in the hills with relatives, meant to be raised away from the settlement's poisonous influence and the judges who might recognize features they'd planted through violence. But young ones wander, curious and unknowing, following adults back to places they've been warned away from. The boy must have followed one of the courthouse servants, must have been sleeping in some corner when the hemlock and fire did their work. Tobias had never even known his name. His mother had kept that secret along with so many others, afraid that acknowledging the boy's existence would give the judges leverage, would create another vulnerability they could exploit. Now the boy was ash without identity, grief without witness, a death that official records would never count because his life had never been officially recorded. The settlement's women, both the respectable married ones and those who worked in the brothels, began avoiding the native camp with new intensity. Some claimed they'd seen spirits near the burned courthouse, pale shapes that wailed in languages older than Latin or English. Others reported dreams where fire consumed everything they touched, where their own offspring burned while they stood paralyzed, unable to move or scream or do anything except witness destruction they'd somehow caused. Superstition or guilt by proxy, the effect was the same, a widening circle of empty space around Tobias and the other native people, as if proximity might carry contamination, as if whatever had driven him to burn 7 men alive might be contagious, might spread to others who had their own grievances against the territorial authorities and their own capacity for violence when pushed beyond endurance. Only old Hannah Clark, a widow who ran a boarding house on the settlement's southern edge, broke the silence. She'd lost her husband to a mining accident 3 years earlier, had raised 2 daughters alone in a town that didn't value women except as property or labor. She brought Tobias bread one morning, set it down near where he was working without a word, and left before he could acknowledge the gesture or refuse it. That evening, he returned the basket with fresh trout from Kettlebone Creek, cleaned and wrapped in wild grape leaves. Nothing was said. Some treaties exist below language, some alliances form in the spaces between words where shared understanding of suffering creates bonds that don't require explanation or formal declaration. But the question that haunted the settlement's quiet moments, that whispered through the canvas-walled saloons and the rough timber churches, was this: how many others were watching and waiting, learning from Tobias's example that violence could succeed where petitions failed, that fire could accomplish what negotiation never would? How many servants smiled while planning murder? How many cooks measured ingredients with revenge in their hearts? How many native people, forced into proximity with settlers who'd stolen their land and violated their families, were now calculating what patience and poison and a single match could accomplish? Territorial Governor Alexander Davis addressed this fear in a proclamation that was read aloud to miners and merchants, but never to the native population. It discussed the need for respectful engagement with the indigenous peoples, for fair treatment under territorial law, for protection of native rights to traditional hunting and fishing grounds. What he meant was simpler and more calculated. We're outnumbered 10-1, and we just learned they can burn us while we sleep. The power balance we pretended didn't exist has shifted, become visible, impossible to ignore. Any measures that might inspire collective retaliation were hereby forbidden. No more forced service in territorial buildings. No more casual abductions of native women from the creeks and fishing grounds. Officers were instructed to maintain respectful distance, to offer payment for labor, to understand that cooperation was negotiation between equals, not submission extracted through threats and violence. Some called it enlightened governance, progress toward more humane territorial administration. Others recognized it as fear dressed in diplomatic language. Pragmatism forced on authorities who'd finally understood that their survival depended on the tolerance of people they'd been systematically abusing. The power balance had shifted, invisible to casual observation but absolute in its implications. And everyone in Dustridge understood that civilization's edge was thinner than they'd imagined. Just one person with poison and patience away from collapse. Just one match away from the authorities, discovering that superior weapons meant nothing against enemies who could simply fade into terrain they knew intimately, while settlers starved or froze or died of exposure in a landscape that had never wanted them. Tobias continued his work, fishing and hunting, while the settlement rebuilt its courthouse with stone instead of timber, with multiple exits and external locks and guards posted through the night. Not understanding that walls and guards were useless against someone who'd already lost everything, who'd already killed the one piece of future he hadn't known existed until the moment of destroying it. The real fire was inside him now, burning in places that water couldn't reach, consuming pieces of himself that he'd need for whatever came after this moment, this day, this impossible present where he existed as both victim and perpetrator, both righteous and damned, deserving of protection and punishment in measures that no authority, native or territorial, could properly calculate. Sheriff Brown stood on the bluff where the old courthouse had burned, watching smoke rise from cooking fires throughout the settlement, and understood something that his badge and authority couldn't protect him from. The boy who'd burned 7 judges hadn't disappeared or been captured or faced any consequence that official justice could impose. He was still here, still moving through Dustridge like smoke through timber, present but untouchable. A reminder that some debts get paid in ash, and some fires never fully extinguish, because the fuel, injustice, and rage and grief beyond measure keeps regenerating with every new violation, every new theft, every new act of violence disguised as law. The settlement had survived the burning, had rebuilt its courthouse, had reinforced its authority through proclamations and new regulations. But something fundamental had changed, become visible, impossible to ignore. The native people weren't disappearing into history the way territorial expansion required. They were still here, still watching, still remembering every broken promise and violated treaty and murdered family member. And one of them had just demonstrated that patience and poison could accomplish what arrows and axes never would, that civilization's institutions were just timber and flesh waiting for someone angry enough, desperate enough, grieving enough to bring the fire that would reduce everything to ash in memory, and the question that had no comfortable answer. What happens next when violence succeeds and the people you've oppressed discover they don't have to accept oppression, don't have to wait for justice that never arrives, don't have to believe that their suffering serves some greater purpose beyond enriching those who caused it? 4 months passed before anyone from Dustridge saw Tobias again in a way that made them understand he'd transformed into something they didn't recognize, something that frightened them more than the courthouse burning had, because at least fire was comprehensible, was a force that could be fought with water and sand and bucket brigades working in coordination. The sighting came from a timber crew working the northern pine forests in late December 1852. Prospector Samuel Thompson reported it to his foreman with the nervous energy of someone who'd seen something impossible but couldn't unsee it, couldn't dismiss it as trick of light or exhaustion or too much whiskey the night before. The forest there grew dense with lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, the canopy so thick that midday felt like twilight, that turned snow into a constant drizzle of melt even when the sky above the trees stayed frozen and clear. Thompson had been marking trees for cutting when he glimpsed movement, a figure painted entirely in white clay, moving through the timber with silence that suggested either supernatural skill or supernatural origin. "Was it him?" the foreman asked, though he already knew the answer, could read it in Thompson's face, in the way his hands shook while rolling a cigarette that he couldn't quite manage to light. Had to be. Same build, same age, but the clay covered him head to foot like a ghost, like something that had died and come back wearing its burial paint. He looked straight at me and I swear his eyes were empty, like looking into wells that go down forever without hitting water or bottom or anything except more darkness. The white clay wasn't decoration or camouflage or war paint. It was declaration, announcement, transformation made visible. The Salish people painted themselves with sacred clays and ochres for specific ceremonies, for mourning periods that lasted months or years, for initiations into new states of being that marked them as fundamentally changed by experiences that ordinary life couldn't accommodate. White clay applied fully, covering every inch of skin, traditionally marked someone undergoing death and rebirth, someone transitioning between worlds, someone who'd crossed boundaries that most people never approached and couldn't return from unchanged. Tobias had covered himself in the color of ash and smoke and bone, announcing that the boy who'd brought firewood to the courthouse no longer existed, had burned along with the judges and his unknown brother, and whatever innocence he'd carried before discovering that survival sometimes required becoming the monster that civilization claimed native people already were. From missionary records dated 1867, collected 15 years after the courthouse burning, the native people speak of a spirit walker who moves between the living and dead, who cannot be harmed by ordinary weapons because he's already died and therefore cannot die again. They claim he drinks poison like water, that fire doesn't burn him, that he exists in the spaces between heartbeats where normal rules don't apply. They call him the one who grinds, though what he's grinding, sorrow or rage or the bones of his enemies, varies depending on who's telling the story. The sightings multiplied through winter and into spring. A trapper near the headwaters of Kettlebone Creek saw him watching from a ridgeline at dawn, motionless as stone, his white-painted face visible even at 200 yards. A freight wagon heading toward Fort Benton spotted him standing in the middle of the frozen road at midnight, forcing them to detour through timber, where they nearly lost an axle to hidden rocks beneath the snow. Native people traveling between winter camps reported encounters that they described in hushed tones, speaking of someone who'd become untethered from normal existence, who performed ceremonies incorrectly or not at all, who spoke in fragments mixing Salish and English, and languages that might have been neither, might have been the private vocabulary of someone whose grief had become too large for existing words to contain. He never approached Dustridge, never crossed the invisible boundary that the burning had established, never gave territorial authorities justification for arrest or violence or the confrontation that everyone expected and nobody wanted. But his presence haunted the settlement more effectively than any physical proximity could have achieved, more thoroughly than if he'd stood on the bluff every night howling threats and promises of revenge. The message was clear to anyone capable of reading it. Exile had failed to eliminate him, invisibility was a choice he could revoke whenever purposes required it. And the transformation he'd undergone made him something that normal justice couldn't address, because normal justice assumed people who could be threatened or bargained with or intimidated into submission. A traveling preacher who'd studied native customs before coming west explained it to Governor Davis during one of their meetings. He's performing a death ceremony, a purification ritual meant to cleanse spiritual contamination from acts that violate tribal law. Among the Salish and related peoples, when someone commits violence that crosses certain boundaries, killing kin or violating sacred protocols, they sometimes undergo ritual death, a period of isolation and transformation meant to separate them from their previous identity. And after the cleansing? Davis asked, hoping for information that might help him understand whether this situation would resolve itself or escalate into something worse. They return, different name, different status, but integrated back into the community. Or they don't return at all. Sometimes the ritual death becomes permanent. Sometimes people walk into the mountains and never come back because the cleansing reveals that what they've done can't be undone, can't be forgiven, can't be accommodated within any framework that allows continued existence among others. Which path was Tobias walking? Toward eventual reintegration or toward permanent exile that would end with his bones scattered in some hidden canyon where no one would ever find them or know his story? Nobody could say, and perhaps he didn't know himself, was walking day by day waiting to discover whether grief would kill him or transform him, or simply burn everything away until nothing remained except the white clay and the emptiness underneath. What would you become if you'd lost everything, avenged everything, and destroyed the one piece of future you hadn't known existed until the moment of killing it? The question had no comfortable answer because comfortable answers required hope, required the possibility of redemption or resolution or some ending that made sense of the suffering that had preceded it. The native people who encountered him in the high country told stories that circulated through their communities, in whispered conversations around fires that burned low so the light wouldn't attract attention from settlers who might be listening, might be gathering intelligence about where the native populations were camping and what they were planning. Private Joseph Taylor claimed he'd been weeping, though from 100 yards in moonlight he couldn't possibly have confirmed tears on a clay-covered face. Private Matthew Moore insisted he'd been laughing, a sound that carried across the distance and made his skin crawl, made him want to abandon his post and run until the sound stopped following him. Both were probably wrong, both were projecting their own guilt and fear onto a figure that had moved beyond performing emotions for observers, that felt whatever he felt internally now, invisible beneath white clay and practiced stillness. He'd become what exile and grief together created, a living memorial to violence that nobody wanted to remember but everyone could feel pressing against their consciousness like a thumb against a bruise, like pressure behind the eyes that warns of storms coming even when the sky looks clear. Governor Davis considered sending a delegation to speak with him to offer what exactly? Reconciliation, apology, permission to return under conditions that would satisfy nobody, because how do you reconcile with someone whose sister you enslaved and whose brother you killed accidentally while he was killing the men who'd enslaved his sister? The moral mathematics were impossible, created equations that had no solutions, only increasingly complex problems that multiplied the more you tried to solve them. He drafted 4 different letters and burned them all, recognizing that some conversations couldn't happen because the language for them didn't exist in English or Salish or any human tongue. You couldn't negotiate with someone who'd moved beyond negotiation, who'd discovered that justice and vengeance were just different words people used to avoid admitting they wanted the same thing. Balance restored through blood and fire, and consequences that matched the scale of original violations. The summer of 1853 was particularly harsh. Supply wagons arrived less frequently as the trails through the mountains became impassable from rockslides and flooding. Scurvy weakened the mining workforce because fresh vegetables wouldn't grow in soil that seemed poisoned against European crops. Native resistance to territorial expansion increased as settlers pushed farther into traditional hunting grounds, disrupting the seasonal movements of game that native communities depended on for survival. And through it all, Tobias haunted the boundaries like a conscience the settlement wished it could ignore but couldn't, like a debt collector who wouldn't accept payment in the debased currency of excuses and official proclamations about improved native relations. He was preparing for something. That much was obvious to anyone paying attention. The sightings weren't random wandering or the aimless movements of someone lost in grief. They were reconnaissance, mapping not just geography but patterns of movement, timing of supply wagons, locations of vulnerabilities in the settlement's defenses that had been erected against external attack, but never considered internal threat from someone who'd already demonstrated what patience and poison could accomplish. The question haunting Dustridge's quiet moments, whispered in saloons and churches and the rough timber buildings where merchants sold supplies at inflated prices, was simple and terrifying. What does someone who's already lost everything and killed everyone still want? The answer came in July, delivered not with fire this time, but with something far more terrifying, absolute silence that would force Dustridge to confront exactly what it had created when it gave Tobias every reason to become a weapon and no reason to ever stop being one. On July 8, 1853, every native person within 10 miles of Dustridge vanished simultaneously. The traders didn't arrive at dawn with furs and fresh game. The guides who'd been leading prospecting expeditions into the high country didn't show up for scheduled departures. The native women who'd been doing laundry for the settlement's wealthier residents simply didn't appear at the creek where they usually worked. The settlement woke to absence so complete it felt like physical pressure, like the air had changed density, like diving underwater where sound travels differently and direction becomes uncertain. The bark canoes that usually moved along Kettlebone Creek sat empty on the banks. The fires that typically sent smoke signals across the ridges remained unlit. The trails through the timber showed no fresh tracks, no signs of movement, no evidence that hundreds of people who'd lived here for millennia had existed at all, beyond the stories settlers told themselves about vanishing races and manifest destiny. Beyond the way, Sheriff Brown organized search parties by mid-morning, more confused than alarmed initially, thinking maybe there was a ceremony or gathering he hadn't been informed about, some native custom that required temporary withdrawal. 8 groups of 4 men each fanned out in different directions, checking the usual camping spots, the seasonal fishing grounds, the sacred sites that native people had cautiously shared information about when relations between the communities were better than they'd become. They found nothing. Not bodies, not tracks, not even the debris of hasty departure or signs of struggle. The native population had evaporated like morning dew, leaving behind only empty spaces where human presence should have been, where human presence had been continuously for thousands of years before the first European trappers had arrived, carrying diseases and metal tools and ideas about property that would transform everything. "It's him," quote, Governor Davis said to Sheriff Brown at noon, standing at the window of the temporary government office that had been established after the courthouse burned. "He's organized this somehow, convinced them to withdraw." Organized what exactly? Brown removed his hat, wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cool mountain air. An entire population doesn't simply disappear because one person suggests it. These are independent bands, different families. They don't take orders from anyone, especially not from someone who's become an exile from his own people. Don't they? Davis turned from the window. "We exiled him, and now his people have exiled us. Removed themselves so completely that we're forced to confront exactly how dependent we've become on their knowledge, their labor, their tolerance of our presence." He didn't order them to leave. He showed them that leaving was possible, that withdrawal was a weapon we never anticipated, because we assumed they needed us more than we needed them. The truth of it settled over the settlement like ash, coating everything, making it hard to breathe without tasting the bitter reality. The native people had been teaching settlers which plants were edible and which were deadly, which water sources were safe year-round and which dried up by midsummer, where game could be found in different seasons, how to read weather patterns in mountains that created their own climate systems unrelated to what the sky looked like at any given moment. They'd been trading game for metal tools, demonstrating fire management techniques that prevented the catastrophic blazes that European land use practices seemed to invite, serving as guides through terrain that killed unprepared travelers through exposure or starvation, or simple disorientation in forests where every tree looked identical and valleys circled back on themselves in ways that defied compass navigation. Their absence wasn't just symbolic or emotional, it was immediately and practically dangerous in ways that became clearer with each passing hour. From the settlement's provision records, July 9, 1853, fresh meat supplies, none. Game procurement without native guides, unsuccessful. Hunting parties returned empty-handed after becoming lost in timber, required rescue. Estimated time before food shortage becomes critical, 2 weeks. Morale declining. Some prospectors discussing abandonment of claims and return to civilization. The miners noticed first because they always noticed when something affected their immediate survival. They'd been supplementing official provisions with game obtained through trade with native hunters who knew where elk congregated in summer, where deer trails led to meadows, where mountain sheep grazed on slopes too steep for European hunters to safely navigate. Without those sources, everyone would be living on salt pork and hardtack that was already running low after a difficult supply season, after wagons had been delayed by weather, and one had been lost entirely to a river crossing that went wrong. The settlement's gardens, such as they were, couldn't sustain 300 people through summer and into the winter that would follow. Hunting parties without native guides got lost in forests that all looked the same, came back exhausted and empty-handed after wandering in circles for hours, unfamiliar with the patterns and movements of animals that had no European equivalents, that behaved differently than deer or rabbits back east. By the 3rd day, panic began replacing confusion. Search parties ranged farther into the mountains, finding campsites that had been methodically cleaned, every tool removed, every fire pit covered with stone and earth, every sign of habitation erased as if the land itself had swallowed the evidence of human occupation. One party found a single object left behind, placed deliberately in the center of a cleared area positioned where it couldn't be missed. A grinding stone, ancient by the wear patterns, showing use by multiple generations. On its surface, someone had arranged hemlock stems in a pattern that needed no translation, that spoke in the universal language of threat and promise and reminder that what had happened once could happen again. What would you feel waking up to discover that the people you'd displaced had simply withdrawn their presence, leaving you to survive or fail on your own merits without the assistance you'd taken for granted, while simultaneously treating those who provided it as inferior, as obstacles to progress, as problems requiring solutions that usually involved removal or elimination or forced assimilation? A traveling merchant named Nicholas Clark reappeared on the 5th day, walking into Dustridge alone just after sunset. He'd been trading with native communities for 3 years, spoke enough Salish to conduct business, had developed relationships based on mutual benefit rather than coercion. He looked thinner, exhausted, as if he'd traveled great distances without adequate rest or food. Governor Davis received him immediately in the temporary office, desperate for explanation or negotiation or any information that might end the increasingly desperate situation that was seeing miners abandon their claims and head back east, that was creating genuine possibility that the settlement might simply fail, might be abandoned as untenable, without the native cooperation that everyone had assumed was permanent and unconditional. "Where are they?" Davis asked without preamble, without offering the whiskey or tobacco that normally preceded business discussions in frontier settings. "Beyond the continental divide, scattered across territories where you don't have jurisdiction or authority or any ability to follow without dying of exposure or starvation." Clark accepted the chair Davis indicated, sat heavily. "They're holding council, deciding whether to return or stay gone permanently, whether this land can support both our people and theirs, or whether one of us has to leave for the other to survive. This is his doing. This is your doing, his, yours, everyone's who thought you could take land and people and dignity without consequences." Clark's voice carried exhaustion rather than anger. He walked into the gathering 3 weeks ago, still painted white, still carrying his grief like a second skin that he can't remove no matter how much time passes. He didn't speak at first, just sat and listened while the elders debated what to do about Dustridge, about the violence, about the future their grandchildren would inherit if patterns continued unchanged. Davis leaned forward. What did he say? He said 7 words that changed everything, that shifted the entire framework of how they understood their relationship to this settlement and everyone in it. Clark paused, let the silence stretch. He said, "We don't need them, they need us." The simplicity of it was devastating, was a truth so obvious that everyone had somehow avoided seeing it, until someone finally spoke it aloud in a gathering where it could take root and grow and transform into collective action. For 10 months, the territorial authorities had been treating the native population as a problem to be managed, a threat to be contained, obstacles to settlement that required removal or subjugation, or forced assimilation into European ways. Tobias had revealed the opposite truth, had made visible what the white clay and the burning and the silent watching had been demonstrating all along. The settlers were the dependent party, parasites who had arrived with inadequate knowledge and survived only through native tolerance and assistance that everyone had mistaken for submission or acceptance of European superiority. "What do they want?" Davis asked, though he already knew the answer would be something he couldn't provide, something that required admitting errors that official policy could never acknowledge. "They want you to understand what you've taken. They want you to feel what exile means, to be cut off from everything that sustains you, to be at the mercy of forces that owe you nothing and have every reason to let you fail." Clark stood, moved to the window, looked out at the settlement that seemed smaller now, more fragile, more temporary in its presumption of permanence. "They want you to experience 1 week of what Tobias has experienced for nearly a year, what his people have experienced for the 3 years since Dustridge was founded on land where their ancestors are buried. And after the week, that depends on what you learn, whether you're capable of learning anything that contradicts the stories you tell yourselves about manifest destiny and civilizing missions and bringing progress to wilderness that was never wilderness, just home to people whose way of life you couldn't recognize as civilization because it didn't look like Philadelphia or Boston or wherever you came from." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything nobody wanted to say, full of the recognition that the settlement couldn't survive long-term without native cooperation, that territorial authority meant nothing in terrain where the people who actually belonged to the land could simply fade into mountains and forests that Europeans barely understood and couldn't navigate without guides. This wasn't a war that could be won with superior weapons or military discipline. This was a war of attrition, and the side that actually belonged to the land, that had lived here for thousands of years and knew every water source and game trail and seasonal pattern, had every advantage that mattered for long-term survival. Governor Davis made several decisions in the next 2 hours that would change the trajectory of territorial policy for the next decade. He ordered all prospecting operations to cease temporarily, to stop pushing into new territories until relations with the native population could be stabilized. He drafted a proclamation that Clark would carry back to the Native Council, acknowledging that the settlement had committed wrongs and expressing willingness to negotiate new terms of coexistence that treated Native people as equals rather than obstacles or resources to be exploited. He reduced mining operations to essential maintenance only, conserving food and energy as supplies dwindled and the reality of potential starvation became impossible to ignore. And he wrote a separate letter to the territorial governor in Washington, marked confidential, explaining that the colonial project was failing not because of native hostility, but because it had never properly accounted for the humanity and agency of the people whose land was being occupied, whose resources were being extracted, whose very existence was being treated as temporary inconvenience rather than permanent reality. That letter would take months to arrive, and longer for a response that would mostly ignore the concerns it raised, because admitting them would require restructuring the entire framework of westward expansion and territorial acquisition. On the 8th day, Native people began returning to the areas around Dustridge, not all at once, not with any formal announcement, just gradually reappearing like tide coming back to shore. The traders returned to their usual spots with fresh game. The guides made themselves available for prospecting expeditions. The women resumed their work along Kettlebone Creek, washing clothes and gathering plants with the same rhythms they'd practiced for generations. But something fundamental had shifted, had become visible and undeniable. The power dynamic everyone had pretended didn't exist was now obvious to even the most stubborn settler who'd believed that superior technology and European civilization automatically conferred superiority in all matters. Tobias didn't return to Dustridge. He stayed in the high country beyond the settlements, his white-painted figure occasionally spotted by travelers but never approached, never spoken to, never integrated back into either native or settler society. He'd become permanent exile, permanent reminder, permanent ghost haunting the boundaries between worlds that could coexist but never fully merge. Nicholas Clark told Governor Davis one final detail during their last meeting about the Week of Silence, a detail that wouldn't appear in any official record but would circulate through the settlement in whispered conversations that carried more truth than documents ever would. When Tobias had convinced the native people to withdraw, he'd said something else after his initial 7 words, something the elders hadn't fully understood but had felt the truth of anyway, had recognized as wisdom born from suffering that exceeded normal human capacity to endure. He'd said, "They killed my sister, so I killed their judges. They burned my future, so I burned their courthouse. They created me through their violence, and now they're frightened of what they created. Let them taste absence. Let them understand that some things once destroyed can never be restored, that some relationships once broken can't be mended with proclamations or promises or anything except time measured in generations rather than years." The settlement had survived the Week of Silence, but barely, and more importantly, it had learned what Tobias had always known, that power wasn't just about weapons or authority or the ability to inflict violence. Sometimes power was simply the choice to withdraw, to absent yourself from systems that required your presence, to say no so completely that yes became the only word that mattered, the only currency that could purchase cooperation from people who'd learned that cooperation given freely was cooperation that could be withdrawn just as freely. The courthouse had been rebuilt stronger after the fire, erected with stone instead of timber, positioned on higher ground with better sight lines and multiple exits. The settlement's defenses had been reinforced after the burning, with guards and patrols and regulations about who could enter territorial buildings. But no defense existed against absence, against silence, against an entire people choosing to simply disappear and let the settlers face the consequences of their own inadequacy, their own ignorance, their own presumption that they could survive in this land without learning from those who'd survived here for millennia. Tobias had taught them that lesson using nothing more than patience, persuasion, and the white clay that marked him as already dead and therefore impossible to kill again. Impossible to threaten or intimidate or bargain with, because people who've lost everything have nothing left to lose, nothing to protect except principles that become more important than survival, when survival requires compromise with those who destroyed everything you valued. But the final lesson was still coming, and it would arrive wearing a face nobody expected, carrying a story that connected the courthouse burning to futures nobody could have predicted when Tobias struck that first match and transformed himself from victim into perpetrator, from person into symbol, from someone with a name and history into something larger and more terrible and more necessary than individual identity could contain. 23 years later, in 1876, a young woman named Abigail Crow walked into the Territorial Archives in Helena, Montana, carrying documents written in 2 languages and a determination to uncover truths that official history had buried beneath layers of convenient lies and selective memory. She was 24 years old, mixed blood with features that told stories of violence and survival, of 2 worlds meeting in ways that were rarely consensual and never equal. Her mother had been Salish, her father unknown, and she'd been raised by missionaries who'd found her as an infant in a camp near the Three Forks area, abandoned or orphaned or simply left because keeping her would have meant complications that nobody wanted to explain. The missionaries had named her Abigail, given her their own surname of Crow without knowing or caring that Crow was the anglicized version of the name that Tobias had carried, that the coincidence wasn't coincidence at all, but connection that ran deeper than baptism or Christian education, or any attempt to sever her from the heritage that showed in her face and in the fragments of Salish language that she remembered from dreams that felt more like memories. From Abigail Crow's petition to the Montana Territorial Government, September 12, 1876, I request access to all records pertaining to the Dustridge Courthouse fire of August 17, 1852. I have reason to believe that the person known as Tobias Crow, listed in territorial records as a person of interest in said fire, was my father. I seek to understand what happened and why the official accounts contradict the stories told by native elders who knew him before his transformation. The territorial clerk who received her petition was young, had been born after the courthouse burning, knew it only as legend rather than lived experience. But older clerks remembered, and when her request reached the desk of the territorial historian, a man who'd been in Dustridge during that summer of silence, who'd watched native people vanish and return and understood that nothing had been the same afterward, he made a decision that would have consequences he couldn't fully anticipate. He granted her access to everything, not just the sanitized official reports but the suppressed testimonies, the letters that had never been sent, the documents that revealed how close the settlement had come to complete failure during that week when absence became weapon and silence became judgment that no court could overturn. Abigail spent 3 weeks in the archives, reading by lamplight in a basement room where dust motes danced like spirits, and the smell of old paper mixed with the scent of ink that had faded but not disappeared, that still carried the traces of hands that had written these words decades earlier. She found testimonies that had never been entered into official records, accounts from miners who'd witnessed Tobias standing in the cottonwood shadows watching the courthouse burn, from women who'd seen him painted white moving through the high country like a ghost that refused to accept death as permanent condition. She found Governor Davis's unsent letters attempting to explain the inexplicable, trying to find language for a situation that exceeded the vocabulary of territorial administration and legal precedent. She found medical reports from the physician who'd examined the bodies, who'd noted the symptoms consistent with hemlock poisoning, but had been instructed to attribute death to smoke inhalation and fire, because acknowledging poison would require acknowledging premeditation, would transform the narrative from tragic accident to calculated murder that authorities couldn't punish without risking wider conflict. Most significantly, she found a journal that Sheriff William Brown had kept privately, never intending for official eyes, full of observations and theories, and the slow recognition that justice was a word people used when they wanted to avoid admitting that power determined outcomes more than morality or law, or any principle that couldn't be enforced through violence or the credible threat of violence. From Sheriff Brown's private journal, October 3, 1853, I know who burned the courthouse, everyone knows. But knowing and proving are different things, and proving and prosecuting are different still. The boy lost his sister to men who called slavery employment, who called rape authority, who used law as weapon against people who had no standing in that law's framework. He responded with fire. Now we pretend we don't know, and he pretends to be a ghost, and everyone agrees that this pretense is preferable to the truth that would require us to choose between justice that admits our complicity and order that requires his execution. Abigail copied everything by hand, her fingers cramping as she transcribed hundreds of pages across weeks of work that left her eyes burning and her back aching from hunching over documents that crumbled at the edges from age and neglect. She was assembling something that had never existed in one place, a complete account that included the official lies, and the suppressed truths and the testimonies that existed in the space between, that acknowledged complexity, rather than reducing history to simple narratives about heroes and villains. When she finally emerged from the archives, she carried not just documents but understanding that changed how she saw her own face in mirrors, how she interpreted the features that marked her as mixed blood, as the product of histories that were rarely consensual and never simple. She spent the next year traveling through Montana Territory, seeking out elders who remembered Tobias before his transformation, who could tell her stories that documents couldn't capture about what he'd been like as a young person before grief and rage had burned away everything except the determination to make someone pay for what had been taken. An old woman named Zarina Claveth, nearly 90 years old, remembered him gathering herbs with his mother Kellis, learning the plants that healed and the plants that killed, and the fine line between medicine and poison that depended on dosage and intent, and the skill of the person who prepared them. He was gentle, Zarina said in Salish that Abigail had relearned through months of effort, through conversations with speakers who were dying faster than young people were learning the language. He laughed easily. He had patience with the younger ones who wanted to learn but couldn't sit still long enough to listen properly. When the settlers came, he tried to build bridges, thought maybe two peoples could share the land if they learned to understand each other. What changed him? What changes anyone? Loss that exceeds the heart's capacity to process it, violence that reveals the world is crueler than you'd imagined. The discovery that justice is just a word that powerful people use to justify whatever they were already planning to do. Zarina looked away toward mountains that had witnessed generations of her people living and dying and continuing despite everything that tried to eliminate them. The settlers made him into a weapon, then acted surprised when he fired. Abigail also found the place where Tobias had died, or where people believed he'd died, though no body was ever recovered, and some claimed he'd simply walked into the mountains and kept walking until geography consumed him or transformed him into something that landscapes absorbed rather than rejected. It was a canyon in the Bitterroot Range, high enough that snow persisted year-round in the shadows, remote enough that few people ventured there, except those fleeing something or seeking something or moving between worlds in ways that required isolation from both. Local hunters reported finding a shelter there, a lean-to constructed from pine branches and bark, inside of which were objects arranged with ceremony's precision, a grinding stone worn smooth by generations of use, a clay pot containing seeds of both food crops and poisonous plants, a piece of white clay that had been shaped into something between human figure and abstract representation of grief, and a bundle of papers covered in writing that mixed English and Salish and symbols that belonged to neither language. Abigail retrieved these objects with permission from the Salish elders who considered the site sacred, who understood that she was trying to preserve rather than exploit, to honor rather than sensationalize. The papers were fragmentary, damaged by weather and time, but the portions that remained legible told a story that official records had never captured. They were letters, never sent, addressed to his sister Nadira, to his mother Kellis, to the brother whose name he'd never learned but whose face had haunted him until the white clay had finally consumed even memory's capacity to wound. They spoke of guilt that persisted beyond revenge, of grief that outlived the objects of grief, of the impossibility of return once certain boundaries had been crossed. From Tobias's unsent letters, date unknown, I thought fire would cleanse. I thought revenge would balance the scales that your death had tipped. Instead, I learned that some acts stain beyond any purification, that the line between justice and murder exists only in the minds of people who've never had to choose between them. I killed our brother. I didn't know he existed until I saw him burning, until I recognized our father's features in his face, and understood that violence creates consequences that extend beyond the original perpetrators and victims. They made me through their crimes, and I remade myself through mine, and now I exist nowhere except in the space between worlds where belonging is impossible and exile is permanent. Abigail assembled everything into a manuscript she titled The Fire That Never Died: One Man's War Against Territorial Injustice in 1850s Montana. It took her 3 years to write, working in the margins of her life as a teacher in a school that educated both white and Native students, that tried to bridge worlds that her own existence proved could produce offspring even if they couldn't produce understanding. The manuscript was rejected by every publisher she approached. Too controversial, they said. Too sympathetic to someone who'd murdered 7 men. Too critical of territorial authorities whose descendants were now respectable citizens who wouldn't appreciate having their grandfathers' crimes made public. Too honest about the violence that had founded every settlement in the West, that had cleared land through methods that polite society preferred to forget or reimagine as heroic conquest rather than systematic displacement. She finally published it herself in 1881, printing 200 copies that she distributed to libraries and schools, and anyone who'd accept them. Most copies were destroyed or lost. A few survived in archives where they gathered dust for decades, where they waited for historians who'd eventually recognize their value as primary sources documenting perspectives that official histories had deliberately excluded. But Abigail had accomplished something more important than publication. She'd preserved the story in complete form, had created a record that acknowledged complexity rather than simplifying it, that treated Tobias as fully human rather than reducing him to symbol or villain or victim or any single category that couldn't contain the contradictions that actual humans embody. She'd ensured that when future generations asked what had happened in Dustridge in 1852, there would be an answer that included the courthouse burning and the week of silence and the transformation of one person's grief into collective action that changed how 2 peoples understood their relationship to each other and to the land they both claimed, but only one had belonged to for thousands of years. The grinding stone that Tobias had carried into the mountains was eventually donated to the Montana Historical Society, where it sits today in a climate-controlled case with explanatory text that tries to summarize in a few paragraphs what actually required Abigail's entire manuscript to approach adequately. Visitors stand before it, reading about the courthouse fire, and the native resistance, and the complicated legacy of westward expansion. School groups discuss whether Tobias was hero or villain or something that exceeded those categories. Teachers try to explain that history isn't simple, that the same person can be victim and perpetrator depending on which moment you examine, that justice and vengeance are words that describe the same actions from different perspectives. And late at night, when the museum is closed and the security guards walk their routes through halls full of artifacts that once belonged to living people with living griefs and living rage, some report feeling presences they can't quite explain, sensing that history isn't past but persistent, that some stories refuse to stay contained behind glass and explanatory text. They say Tobias still walks the boundaries between worlds, still painted white, still carrying grief that death couldn't resolve because the questions he raised have no answers that satisfy everyone, no conclusions that make peace with the violence that created Montana Territory and every other place where European expansion met indigenous resistance and claimed victory, even when that victory required forgetting half of what actually happened. The grinding stone endures, worn smooth by hands that are dust now, marked by use patterns that speak to generations of daily labor that sustained life in this land, before anyone thought to call it Montana or claim it for nations that existed an ocean away. The seeds Tobias preserved remain viable, according to botanists who've analyzed them, could theoretically be planted and grown, could resurrect species that have otherwise vanished from landscapes transformed by European agricultural practices. And the story persists, passed through generations in forms that change with each telling but maintain essential truth, that one person with sufficient cause and sufficient determination can shake the foundations of power that seems absolute, that absence can be weapon, that silence can be judgment, that exile can be transformation rather than elimination. Modern Dustridge, if you visit it, is a tourist town now, full of galleries selling Western art and restaurants serving bison burgers to people who drive through on their way to Yellowstone. The site where the courthouse stood is marked with a plaque that mentions the fire in language carefully crafted to avoid taking sides, to acknowledge loss without assigning blame, or exploring why 7 judges were sleeping in a building that someone had thoroughly soaked with kerosene. But if you walk to Kettlebone Creek, where Tobias once ground seeds while planning murder, where his sister once gathered willow bark before her abduction, where native people lived for thousands of years before the first prospector arrived looking for gold, You might understand something that plaques can't communicate. You might understand that some debts persist beyond the lifespans of creditors and debtors, that land remembers what people forget, that history isn't contained in archives but lives in the landscape itself, in the creek that still flows and the cottonwoods that still grow, and the grinding stones that still wait beneath soil for archaeologists to uncover and try to explain in language that reduces lived experience to artifact and context. The fire Tobias started has never fully extinguished. It moved from timber to flesh to memory to legend, burning through generations in forms that change but never disappear, because the fuel keeps regenerating, because injustice creates new grievances, because every act of violence produces consequences that ripple outward, until everyone involved is ash, but the heat remains, impossible to ignore for anyone willing to feel it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.